He entered the house with a kind smile, listened to complaints, nodded, gave an injection, and left. A few hours later, the patient would die. No one suspected that this quiet, neat doctor in glasses was waging a personal war against life itself. Harold Shipman seemed the embodiment of trust, a symbol of care, a pillar for the elderly in a British suburb. But in reality, he was the deadliest serial killer in British history, a man who used his white coat as a disguise for the cold-blooded extermination of hundreds of innocent victims. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in a working-class area of Nottingham. His family was typical of post-war Britain. His father worked as a truck dispatcher, and his mother was a housewife. But it was his mother, Vera Shipman, who played a pivotal role in his life. She was strict, almost fanatically religious, and Harold was her favorite. He received her attention in abundance, unlike his siblings. This special bond with his mother shaped much of his personality, including his need for control and a sense of exceptionalism. When Harold was 17, his mother fell gravely ill. She was diagnosed with lung cancer. Every day, he watched her weaken. Shipman was by her side, helping, bringing food, running errands, holding her hand. He saw a strong, domineering woman turn into a helpless shadow of herself. But one moment stuck with him most, when the doctor treating Vera gave her a morphine injection. Within minutes, she fell asleep and never woke up. That sight burned into his mind. The doctor, with a single injection, relieved her suffering and became the absolute master of her life. In that moment, something dangerous was born in young Shipman, an association between medicine, morphine, and absolute power. As death was a turning point. The following year, Harold enrolled in medical school in Leeds. He was a smart, diligent, but withdrawn student who didn't seek out company. He wasn't studying to be a doctor out of a passion for biology or a desire to help people. He was drawn to a place where he could control pain, death, and destinies. A place where people would look up to him, as his mother once looked up to her doctor. In 1970, he graduated and received his medical license. At this stage, no one could have suspected what kind of doctor he would become. Young, polite, reserved, and highly disciplined. That's the Shipman who showed up at clinics and hospitals. He wore glasses, was always tidy, and spoke to patients in a confident yet gentle tone. To most colleagues, he was dull but reliable. Inside, however, an idea was brewing that would eventually spiral into a bloody obsession. Early in his career, he worked at Pontefract General Infirmary and later at a hospital in Todmorden. That's where the first oddities surfaced. Shipman was caught forging prescriptions for morphine. He was found with an excessive amount of painkillers, far more than needed even for a large ward. He was arrested, admitted guilt, underwent rehabilitation, and received a suspended sentence. From then on, he carried the stigma of a doctor with a troubled past. Yet his medical license remained intact. The system gave him a second chance, and it was this chance he used to begin a silent slaughter. After his suspended sentence for forging prescriptions, Shipman seemed determined to start anew. In 1977, he moved to the small English town of Hyde, Greater Manchester, where he joined the Donnybrook House medical practice. There, he began his transformation into the ideal family doctor, the one entrusted with everything: health, pain, death. Patients adored Dr. Shipman. He was polite, courteous, and never kept them waiting in lines. Elderly women were especially drawn to him. He knew how to listen, didn't rush, and never pushed unnecessary treatments. They spoke of him with gratitude. Dr. Shipman understands us. He's not one of those who just prescribe pills and move on. He often visited patients at home, especially those who couldn't make it to the clinic. These visits became his signature. He'd come, give an injection, and leave. Soon after, death would follow. To the police and death registrars, he appeared to be the perfect doctor. He personally filled out death certificates, listing causes from old age to heart failure, and sent bodies to the crematorium, almost always without an autopsy. He was so respected that no one questioned his records. If the doctor said a death was natural, it was. No one noticed that the mortality rate among his patients was exponentially higher than that of his colleagues in the area, and if they did, they chalked it up to coincidence or the specifics of his patient base. He was punctual, meticulous, and absurdly pedantic. He lived with his wife, Primrose, and their 4 children, adhering to a daily routine as strict as a military regimen. Mornings at the clinic, afternoons on house calls, evenings at home. And every evening, he logged new cases of death in his medical records. No hysteria. Everything was precise and dry, like a bookkeeping report. His method of killing was simple. He'd visit elderly patients, usually but not always those living alone, and administer an injection, intravenously, quickly, quietly. In most cases, it was morphine or a similar potent opioid, given in a lethal dose. The patient would lose consciousness and die within 5-15 minutes. Shipman would calmly wrap up the visit, leave the house, and complete the paperwork. Time of death, symptoms, no witnesses, everything was under his control. There was no rage or chaos in his actions. It felt like a ritual. He didn't just kill, he orchestrated. He decided who lived and who died. Perhaps this was his twisted way of compensating for his mother's death. Perhaps he saw himself as a deliverer from suffering. But later, psychologists would say he derived a sense of godlike power from it. He was judge, executioner, and God. Over time, he grew so confident that he stopped hiding the anomalies. Sometimes deaths occurred one after another. Same day, same doctor, same natural cause, and all without a hint of suspicion. From the late 1980s, the mortality rate among Harold Shipman's elderly patients began to rise. But it happened so subtly that no one noticed the alarming trend. The victims were mostly women over 70, widows, living alone, but not always frail. On the contrary, most were still lively and led active lives. They just died, suddenly, without suffering, without signs of struggle. And Dr. Shipman calmly and confidently filled out their death certificates. He was never in a hurry. Sometimes he'd come to a patient's home, give an injection, wait a bit, watching their breathing slow, and only then, looking into their lifeless eyes, stand up, remove his gloves, adjust his tie, and leave. It all happened within the framework of his medical visit. Relatives learned of the death afterward, and when they received the medical report stating the cause, natural, there was neither reason nor legal grounds to demand an investigation. But even in a perfectly constructed system, there were glitches. One occurred in 1993. Colleagues began to notice that the number of deaths under Shipman's care was suspiciously high. These were patients he had seen just hours before their deaths. An internal investigation was even launched. But since he was known as a meticulous doctor, all his paperwork was in perfect order. And at the time, there was no national digital database to compare mortality rates among doctors. The investigation was closed. Shipman realized he was untouchable, and he grew bolder. Now he didn't just kill, he began forging wills. In several cases, as the investigation would later establish, he either persuaded elderly women to change their wills or forged them himself. The goal was simple. The inheritance went to the doctor. In one instance, he convinced a patient he was helping her sort out medical paperwork, when in reality, he slipped in documents transferring her property to him. By 1998, the list of the dead exceeded 200. Yet the system still didn't notice. He was beyond suspicion. Colleagues didn't interfere, seeing him as a pedant and a loner. Bureaucracy failed to connect the dots, and relatives believed, how could their beloved doctor be a monster? Everything changed after the death of one woman. Her name was Kathleen Grundy, a lively, kind widow who was active in her community. She was full of energy and planning a trip with her daughter, but the day before Shipman's visit, she died suddenly at home. It was supposed to be another death he'd process as usual, but the doctor made a mistake, and that mistake became his downfall. On June 24, 1998, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy died suddenly at home after a visit from her doctor, Harold Shipman. She had been in good spirits, just back from the store, planning a trip with her daughter and preparing to celebrate her wedding anniversary. But hours after the doctor visited her home, she stopped answering calls. Neighbors found her body in an armchair, a book in her hands. It looked like she had simply fallen asleep. Forever. Harold Shipman, as usual, didn't hesitate. He promptly filled out the death certificate. Cause: old age heart condition. No autopsy was needed. The family trusted the doctor, and the system trusted his authority. Everything was perfect. Except for one detail. Kathleen had a daughter, Angela Woodruff, and she didn't believe in coincidences. Angela was a lawyer. She knew exactly what a legally drafted will looked like, and when she received a copy of her mother's last will, she was stunned. The document claimed Kathleen Grundy left her entire estate, over £300,000, not to her daughter or grandchildren, but to Dr. Harold Shipman. The will had no date or witness signatures, and Kathleen's signature looked foreign, as if copied. Angela refused to let it go. She first asked the notary if he had ever handled Grundy's affairs. He replied that he had never drafted such a will. Moreover, he had an authentic copy of Kathleen's will, drawn up years earlier, dividing her estate among her family. This document directly contradicted the new one. Angela went to the police, and that's when Harold Shipman's mistakes began to unravel. He was certain no one would dare challenge him, that no detective would dig deeper, that he was still untouchable. But the inspectors launched an investigation. The first thing that stood out was that Kathleen's death certificate was filled out incorrectly. Then came discrepancies in her medical records. The doctor claimed she had heart problems, but her family said there were no symptoms. Furthermore, the pharmacy where Shipman supposedly ordered her medications confirmed no prescriptions in her name. The police ordered an exhumation. That's when everything began to collapse. Experts found high levels of diamorphine, medical morphine, typically used in hospices for severe pain, in Kathleen's tissues. But Grundy had no condition requiring such drugs. The morphine was at a dose lethal for someone of her age and build. The investigation accelerated. The police began exhuming other patients' bodies, reviewing death certificates, and interviewing relatives. The picture grew darker. Dozens of elderly women had died in their sleep after Harold's visits. In most cases, he was the only one who saw them alive and the only one who documented their deaths. The handwriting on Kathleen Grundy's will was deemed forged by experts. Comparing her signatures on older documents with the one on the new will, they concluded she didn't write it. Her computer showed no trace of such changes. Everything pointed to Dr. Shipman forging the document, to steal a dead woman's money. One dead woman, her skeptical daughter, and one forged will were enough to expose the darkest, deadliest chapter in British medical history. After the exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body and the shocking toxicology results, Manchester police realized this wasn't an isolated case. Investigators began reviewing all death certificates Shipman had issued over the years. The deeper they dug, the more horrified they became. A web of death was unfolding, with one man at its center, and that man was the respected Dr. Harold Shipman. The forensic team manually analyzed medical records of over 500 deceased patients Shipman had treated. The focus was on elderly women who died at home and were cremated without autopsies. Particular attention was given to cases where Dr. Shipman was the last to see the patient alive, authored the death certificate, and discouraged relatives from requesting autopsies. These made up the majority. To confirm or dispel suspicions, the police exhumed several bodies. Each time, tests revealed diamorphine, a potent narcotic, pure morphine, in doses far exceeding safe limits. It was Shipman's weapon of choice, a drug that disguised death as natural. He could inject it during a visit and then record the death as a heart attack, respiratory failure, or simply natural decline. Investigators were stunned by the scale. Nearly every second case seemed suspicious. On some streets where Shipman practiced, more patients died in a few years than in the rest of the city combined. Moreover, he had a pattern. All the women were over 70, died under similar circumstances, during or soon after his visit. None had reported a sudden health decline before the doctor arrived. Shipman deliberately targeted patients living alone. He left no witnesses. He even knew which families preferred cremation over burial, knowing cremated bodies couldn't be exhumed. In those cases, he acted with utmost confidence. In his twisted logic, he calculated everything. One detective later said, "He didn't just kill. He orchestrated death like a chess game where the victim didn't know they'd already lost." Another chilling fact emerged. Harold Shipman continued killing right up to the day before his arrest. While the investigation was ongoing, he still visited patients, examined them, smiled, gave injections, and documented deaths. Even after Grundy's body was exhumed, he didn't stop. This behavior pointed to a deep pathology. He felt power. He believed himself untouchable. As the case progressed, the police had to involve over a dozen forensic experts, toxicologists, criminologists, and even psychologists to assess his motives. But no logic emerged. Shipman gained no benefit from most killings. Only in rare cases did he forge wills. Most victims left him nothing. The murders were for the act itself. Psychologists suggested Shipman experienced something between addiction and megalomania. He played God. He decided who was ready to go, turning death into routine. Murder wasn't an emotion. It was a mechanism, like an injection, a signature, a log entry. When the victim count surpassed 215, the British press exploded. People were in shock. A respected family doctor, father of 4, serving the community for decades, was a cold-blooded serial killer. Not just a killer, but the deadliest in British history, possibly in human history. The trial of Harold Shipman began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court, one of the most secure buildings in England. The case drew massive attention. Journalists from around the world covered every day of the hearings. Relatives of the victims filled the courtroom, while on the defendant's bench sat an elderly, outwardly calm man with gray hair and a cold gaze. He looked the same as he did dozens of times in his patients' homes, composed, reserved, confident. But now he faced not an elderly person in an armchair, but an entire nation. The prosecution charged him with 15 counts of murder, cases where the evidence was ironclad: exhumations, toxicology reports, forged wills, discrepancies in medical records. But everyone knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators were certain the total number of victims exceeded 200, but proving each murder with absolute certainty was impossible. Too many bodies had been cremated, too little evidence remained. In court, prosecutors read out the names of the deceased, women who died in their sleep, sitting on a couch, in the kitchen, in a rocking chair. Relatives couldn't hold back tears. Shipman sat stone-faced the entire time. No remorse, no emotion. When asked to comment, he simply said, "They all died of natural causes. I had nothing to do with it." A key moment was the case of Kathleen Grundy, the spark that ignited the investigation. The court presented the forged will, handwriting analysis, testimony from her daughter, pharmacists, and neighbors. They also showed medical records where Shipman retroactively added lethal diagnoses. One of the most heart-wrenching episodes was the death of 93-year-old Lillian Schell. Her grandson recounted how that morning his grandmother was baking him an apple pie, and 2 hours later the doctor called to report her death. He claimed she fell asleep from old age, but tests showed she died from a morphine overdose administered by Shipman. Suspiciously, he had personally called the funeral service and demanded immediate cremation. Psychiatrists brought into the case tried to explain his behavior. One called Shipman a pathological narcissist with delusions of omnipotence. Another said, he didn't kill for money or hatred. He killed for the act itself. He felt like the arbiter of fates. The defense tried to cast doubt on the exhumation methods and toxicology reports, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, dozens of people, former colleagues, nurses, victims' relatives, testified one after another. They all said the same. Dr. Shipman seemed impeccable. No one could have imagined a monster lurked beneath that calm. After 6 months of hearings on January 31st, 2000, the jury found Harold Shipman guilty on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forging a will. The judge sentenced him to 15 life terms without parole. But it was a symbolic punishment. Everyone knew the true number of victims could be as high as 250. It was a verdict not just on a man, but on the system that allowed him to wreak havoc for decades. The courtroom met the decision with applause and tears. Some relatives, whose cases never reached formal charges, wept from helplessness. Their loved ones couldn't be brought back, and the guilty would not face punishment for every name. Shipman showed no remorse. Even in the final moments, he stood upright, stone-faced, as if the trial wasn't about him. He didn't apologize, offer explanations, or shed a tear. To many, he remained not a man, but a cold machine of death. After the verdict, Harold Shipman was sent to Wakefield Prison, one of the UK's most secure facilities, housing the country's most dangerous criminals. He was kept under 24-hour surveillance, but even in his cell, he remained the same as he was on the outside, withdrawn, silent, detached. He avoided contact, refused rehabilitation programs, gave no interviews, and categorically dodged questions about his crimes. He just lived as if nothing had happened. But he had a goal. He knew he would go down in history. His name would forever be tied to a number too vast to comprehend. 215, 250, maybe more. A statistic that made him the deadliest serial killer in recorded human history. And he didn't want this story to end on anyone else's terms. On January 13th, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet tied to the window bars. No one intervened in time, neither guards nor doctors. He left the same way he killed, quietly, without words, without explanation. He left no suicide note, no confession, no motives. All he left behind was silence. That's the end of the story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. If you wish, you can also become a paid subscriber to support the channel. Stay safe and see you next time.